I'm the community and marketing manager at Chucklefish. We're an independent game studio based in London. We formed roughly in 2011 in order to make a game called Starbound. Starbound is what is best described as an extraterrestrial sandbox adventure game. So it's primarily a sandbox game in space where you use tools to build things and manipulate the universe. There are infinite worlds, essentially, in that there are like about 5 quintillion worlds or something, more than a person could ever visit. There's a central storyline tied to progression. There are survival elements like hunger, environmental hazards. And the worlds are all procedurally generated. There are procedurally generated NPCs and quests. So it's a game that's quite big in scope. And back in 2011, Chucklefish was a small group of people that was just sort of spread across the globe. We had no studio experience and no funding, and we had this idea for this massive procedurally generated space game, and we thought we could totally complete it within 6 months. We totally did not complete it within 6 months. Instead, it took about 5 years. Starbound was announced in 2012. We went into pre-orders. We had a pre-order campaign in 2013, April 2013. Starbound entered Steam Early Access in December of 2013, and then an eternity later, Starbound was launched out of Early Access in July 2016. So to date, though, despite all this, we have done quite well. Starbound sold about 2.5 million copies. It's still selling pretty steadily. Along the way, we've managed to kind of grow and maintain an active community that's interested in the games that we've published or announced since. This is quite an anecdotal talk about our personal experiences. So it's some of what we did along the way, some of the mistakes that we made, some of the situations that we encountered and how we handled them and how we could have handled them better, maybe. So yeah. For the first few years of Starbound's development, we all worked together remotely. Most of us had never even met in person. And then back in 2012, we were using IRC to keep in touch with each other and our community every day. We would talk to folks quite casually about what we were working on and sort of even run new ideas past them, like, do you think this would be cool to do? What would you like to see in the game? Stuff like that. We felt like we were getting quite valuable feedback, and the community felt like they got to be a part of the development process as well. It was this really sort of casual, organic process of speaking to the people who had heard of our game through other communities, mainly, or through social media, but especially like the Minecraft and Terraria communities that already existed around these sort of sandboxy survival games. One thing we started as soon as Starbound was announced was a developer blog. And throughout development, we tried to update that very frequently, daily when we could, even if we were only talking about a really small change or addition or just posting a single GIF or a single image. This kept our website pretty active so that visitors could easily determine that we were still working on the game and what we were working on. And it also gave us really good material to keep our Twitters and Facebooks and the Starbound subreddit active as well. And in our developer blogs, we've always tried to keep the tone kind of conversational and casual and like a bit frank. We start off posts with like a hey everyone or an evening folks, and we post a lot of bad puns, as you can see. We like to show off some of our best bugs that we find in the game. Individual members of the team all have their own Twitter accounts, and they like to sort of post their own screenshots and GIFs. And then those are retweeted by our official accounts, and that kind of encourages people to follow them as well for more info. So interacting with people in this way has been really valuable for us. Players aren't just interacting with the Starbound account, they're interacting with the developers of Starbound as well, and they're getting to know us as individuals and human beings. And that's helped us to kind of, I think we've sort of built a brand around the games that we make and the other games that we've sort of published and endorsed. Which more or less tend to fit into a similar aesthetic, all sorts of pixel art games. And I think that we've kind of built an audience that shares our taste. Going to take a drink of water. So around the beginning of 2013, we started up this monthly newsletter called the Starbound Chronicle. It was kind of designed to look like a newspaper, and it would include things like a brief roundup of the past month's developments, sometimes exclusive stories and comics, fan art, sometimes a spotlight for mods that people have made for the game, tutorials about how to make mods, and sometimes horoscopes. In 2014, we kind of tried something new with it, which you can kind of see on the left, where we turned the Chronicle into more of an in-universe newspaper with a series of articles that were written by an investigative reporter who was trying to uncover a sinister plot. And a portion of the newsletter was still focused on community contributions, with things like featured mods just kind of framed as advancements in science to make it a little bit more in-universe feeling. And at its height, the Starbound Chronicle had about 50,000 readers. And the time constraints eventually meant that it kind of needed to be shelved, because it did take quite a bit of time each month to put together. We so far haven't had the opportunity to pick it back up again. But it was a cool way at the time for us to kind of deliver a little bit of Starbound news to those who didn't have the patience to pour through our dev blogs and forum posts and Twitter accounts and stuff like that. And I think the creative element and the kind of exclusivity of some of the content within it sort of set it apart from the typical email newsletter, of which you've probably found yourself somehow subscribed to like 70 that you don't tend to read. So I think it was good in that sense. And around the same time that we started the Starbound Chronicle, we started our pre-order campaign. So until 2013, Starbound didn't have any funding, and most of us had other jobs, and we were pretty dissatisfied with the situation and with the funding options that we'd been able to find so far. So we set out to raise the money that we needed ourselves. And on top of allowing us to just survive and eat food while we continue to make the game, acquiring a decent amount of funding felt like it would kind of validate all of the work that we'd put in so far, and it would alleviate the fears that we had that the game wouldn't sell at all, because we really weren't sure at that point. So we started to look into how we could differentiate ourselves from every other Kickstarter campaign that existed. And at the end of that, we kind of decided to skip Kickstarter altogether, and we partnered up with Humble to use their Humble widgets and create kind of a campaign through our own website. And you can kind of see how those work there. So the pre-orders launched on the 13th of April, 2013, and they almost instantly exceeded our expectations. We really weren't sure what to expect out of them. I think that we were thinking that we were hoping that we could make somewhere over the range of like $50,000, but by the 29th of April, we'd exceeded over $1 million in pre-order purchases. And so our pre-order page was Starbound themed. It had like a cute penguin sprite that kind of gradually slid down a rope as it met our funding stretch goals. And as well, people's backer rewards were tied to their forum accounts, the Chucklefish forum accounts that they had made. So people who backed specific tiers there would receive badges under their usernames to denote that they had backed at a specific tier. And this was kind of supposed to happen automatically, although that didn't always work, and there were a lot of manual corrections involved. But people could also receive a badge under their username on the forums just for tweeting about Starbound's pre-orders under a specific hashtag. So this kind of incentivized participation even if people couldn't afford to or didn't want to back the game just yet, because it was quite early on. And I think doing things differently like this did help us to stand out. We weren't just another indie game on Kickstarter. There was a little bit of a twist there. Kickstarter's existing out-of-the-box functionality, though, would have been really useful for communicating with backers, because staying in touch with people who had backed the game early on became quite difficult after a couple of years had passed and we were finally ready to make those backer items. I think that part of the issue there was that we were quite new. We simply had not imagined receiving the amount of support that we did, and we hadn't really prepared for the possibility that we might. We had set quite high stretch goals, but we weren't sure that we were ever going to make those. So yeah, because it wasn't Kickstarter, we didn't have to set an overall funding goal, and we didn't have to have a set time, like a 30-day campaign. So they were allowed to kind of just go on for indefinitely, really. And in setting up our campaign, we had wanted to avoid any rewards that involved physical merchandise. Instead, we opted for limited tiers where backers could collaborate with us on in-game items such as like hats, weapons, and statues. In the end, this was more costly, I think, in terms of hours. Setting aside time for an artist and occasionally a programmer to work on these items and get them to a place where backers were happy with them was a lot more work than we'd anticipated it being back in 2013. We hadn't set clear limitations for what these backer rewards could be, and we'd not really anticipated how creative our community was going to be. So as well as just taking up a lot of development time, it was difficult to ensure that backer items fit the game's aesthetic. It meant a lot of going back and forth and saying, like, no, sorry, this space is 16 pixels wide. It's going to be really difficult to fit half of an angel and half of a demon on the hilt of this sword. That's that sword on the left, on the right, rather. Luckily, though, people were lovely and understood where there were technical and balance limitations, and they were pretty happy to scale things back. So I think the moral of the story there is if you're thinking about crowdfunding and you want to go for in-game rewards rather than physical rewards, clearly define what backer items can be or cannot be, or else be prepared to spend about 20 hours on like a rainbow giant anime sword with particle effects that can tear through the fabric of space and time. I'm not exaggerating for effect there, that sword exists too, and I think it's actually probably one of the coolest swords in the game, but that's just my opinion. So we launched a development roadmap alongside our pre-order campaign in an effort to kind of publicly track how far along we were in each area of development. As you can see, it says estimated release date 2013, so there's one mistake. It was an actual world map, and it had different biomes representing different areas of development, and clicking on one of those nodes would open a list of subsystems with a percentage representing how much of that system was complete. And tiny sprites that represented each of the team members would be placed on the map to show how, what each person was working on. So in theory, this seemed like a really cute way to communicate what we were doing. It was really charming and nice. It was an effort to be transparent, and in practice, it was a total nightmare. Because at this stage, and in a game with as many systems as Starbound, it was really difficult to represent how complete each system was with a percentage, because those often tied into other systems and a lot of changes were made. We were constantly changing the game as we figured out what worked. Asking each person on the team how done their feature was proved pretty inefficient, and in the end, we kind of just had to scrap the whole thing. We demoed Starbound for the first time at Insomnia 49 in September of 2013, which boosted our confidence enough that we decided the game was ready for early access release that December. Our main concern there was whether or not the game was already fun in its current state, even though it was quite early. And we weren't sure if this game could keep the community engaged enough that enough that they would keep playing as development continued. And after the reactions that we received on the show floor, we decided that it could. So post pre-orders and all of the attention that they'd end up receiving, the pressure was well and truly on to deliver the game that we'd set out to make. And early access first served as like a sort of elaborate proof of concept. We wanted to prove to people that while we had a lot left to do, what we had done so far was pretty fun and pretty cool, and that as relative newcomers to the industry, we had the ability to pull it off, which I think was important for us. And Starbound has a story and a mythology that changed a lot throughout development as our ideas about the game evolved, but Starbound's main appeal is in its mechanics and its replayability. It's just in the sheer amount of stuff that you can do and see. And I think this made Starbound a great candidate for early access. As I mentioned earlier, Starbound's got a whole lot going on in terms of systems. So it was really valuable for us to be able to figure out through player feedback which of those were working with within the sandbox and which weren't. We didn't really have to worry about spoiling big plot revelations, as the story content wouldn't come until much later. However, early access did change our development schedule as we added new features and systems. We found ourselves producing updates with a lot of placeholder content in order to keep players engaged. And though Starbound did take a lot longer to complete as a result of early access, I believe, I would say that it did a fairly good job of tempering the community's expectations before launch, because it gave people a better and more tangible idea of what the game actually was. It kind of slowed the hype train, but I think that this may have been ultimately for the best. Once Starbound was funded and released in early access, it became necessary for us to establish an office. As I'd mentioned, we'd previously been working all over the world. It was really difficult to kind of coordinate in time zones. Long term, establishing an office was great for Starbound. In the short term, it was a bit chaotic and it led to a lot of criticism, as a vocal portion of the community did not understand why we were doing this, or why it was worth the money they'd spent backing our project. So with many of us not just moving, but moving continents, it created a bit of lull in development and also in communication during this period, which led to a lot of posts like this. So blog posts and updates became less frequent as we tried to establish a better production timeline now that we were all in the same room, now that we were hiring people like a business manager and a producer and people who had that sort of experience. So we weren't spending as much time creating this placeholder content to keep players entertained. And this kind of led to theories that we just vanished. We'd taken all the Starbound money and run off into the sunset with it. And I think these fears were understandable. We had just accepted money from thousands of people for a game that wasn't finished. So frequent communications about what we were doing and when the game would be finished was more important than ever. And before pre-orders, we had set a precedent for how frequent that communication would be. And now shortly after Starbound's early access launch, we were kind of falling short of those expectations. So our answer to that was nightly builds. Nightly builds were an opt-in beta branch for Starbound players on Steam. And each night we would automatically release a build regardless of how much progress we'd made or what our last commit was. It would just automatically be pushed out there. So it was often broken. We warned people that it was broken. It says keeps getting beta all the time, but it used to say just really, really broken. So nightly builds weren't intended for typical players so much as they were tangible proof that we were working on Starbound every single day. So in lieu of posting about everything that we were doing every day, a portion of the community would play through the nightly build and then post all of the changes that we'd made. There were even a handful of YouTubers who had a series of videos that were dedicated to covering all of the changes we'd made in the nightly builds. And our primary goal here had been transparency, but the nightly builds also had the inadvertent benefit of giving the community something to talk about in between updates and blog posts. Although the trade-off was like the total loss of the element of surprise, because all of the new content that we were working on was exposed as soon as the nightly build went out. And this gave players the opportunity to speculate and speculate on features that were totally unfinished or were just experimental. For example, we created a system where the player could build and decorate houses for NPCs to live in, and in return, the NPCs would pay rent and occasionally give the player quests. That's all we intended for the system to do. But since it's the first iteration in the nightly build, people have expected more out of it, to the extent that we would have to create essentially another city building game within our own game. Which isn't totally unreasonable. We have created games within Starbound, like this visual novel and this 3D maze game, but I think a SimCity clone might have been a little bit out of scope. Nightly builds, though, were massively helpful to us overall. They helped quell a lot of the fears about the state of development, if not the pace of it, and they helped to keep players interested in between updates of the stable version of the game. And I think if we were to do it all over again, we would need to do a better job of managing players' expectations of what features will be once they're complete. There were periods during which developer blogs from us were pretty scarce, and I think that we could have better managed expectations about specific features by announcing and explaining those features ahead of time before the community had the chance to speculate. This is a little different, but something that we decided to do early on when we were developing Starbound was to make it very moddable. It was developed with modding in mind. It's a game with essentially infinite worlds, so it's certainly more planets than anyone could ever hope to visit in their lifetime. And if we were to spend 5 more years developing Starbound, we would not be able to create or even conceive of enough content to fill that many planets. So making the game moddable only made sense to us. We've tried to encourage modding from the start, with programmers from our team kind of hanging out in modding channels on IRC or Discord to answer questions or to help people. In fact, 2 of the programmers who work on Starbound now were Starbound modders whose work that we really liked, so we wanted to hire them. Oh, that's really dark. It's a bunch of broken trees. It's a broken start screen. Throughout early access, we hosted our own makeshift mod repository on the forums. This helped to drive more traffic to our website and encourage the creation of a forum account, since one was required in order to upload and download mods. The Zenfro plugin that we use for the mod repo was just not meant to be a mod repo, though, so it's quite clunky. It's quite clunky to have done it ourselves, and Steam Workshop kind of became a godsend once we finally launched Steam Workshop support. It's also encouraged many more players to use mods. Some of our most popular mods now have upwards of 150,000 subscribers. I think games like Morrowind and Fallout 3 and Doom have proven that modding can add years to the longevity of a game and its community. It does introduce some new communications problems. I would say that something like 90% of our support requests are from players who have downloaded a bunch of conflicting mods and don't understand why the game won't start for them anymore. So we've had to try and make it as clear as possible that while Starbound is a game that supports mods, players are using them at their own risk. So if you do create a moddable game, it's important to consider the increased support workload. It's a bit obvious, but it's particularly important to listen to your player base during early access. They have extremely valuable things to say about which parts of your game feel right at a crucial time in development when you can still change those things. We're quite a small studio, so our development team isn't as isolated from community feedback as a AAA team might be. Our team reads and participates on the forums and subreddit, and they're generally aware of what's going on in the community. Players are going to let you know what they're experiencing and how they feel about it, and they'll let you know how they think you should fix it too. And as a team, I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's not the role of the player to design your game, and ultimately, you need to be able to trust your judgments and not fall into the trap of debating and defending your design decisions with your players. And with everybody on the team paying attention to feedback, it can be easy for group chats to become an echo chamber for negativity. So like, hey, look at this terrible email I just got, or look at this awful thing that someone just said. And I think that some level of commiseration there is healthy. When you receive a particularly negative comment or a super ridiculous email, it can feel really good to share that with the people around you, and just to hear someone else say like, yeah, that was truly terrible, that person sucks. But it's too easy to start feeling as if the majority of your player base hates you and everything is on fire if you take that approach, and don't remember to also look for the positives in your community and look for, which is going to be likely the majority, or at least in our case, there were so many people who were sharing really positive comments, and it helped us a lot to take note of those once in a while and to look at the things that people were creating in our game. In terms of just really cool buildings or just cool fan stories and stuff like that. And I think that just helps with the morale of your team. Just a quick note on privacy, as that I think also becomes really important when you're creating a game that's going to take 5 years to make that people are going to have paid for 3 years ago, and they're really mad at you some of the time. So with everybody interacting personally with the community, sometimes community dissatisfaction or anger kind of was directed at us personally as individuals. So if you're going to take this approach of having everybody kind of involved in community interaction, I think that you need to prepare your team as well as you can to know the risks of that. Know that people are going to try and dig up information about you or hack your personal accounts. So make it a priority to check your social media security settings, generate strong passwords, and enable two-step authentication everywhere you can. This is something that you should do if you're using social media in 2017 anyway, but I'd say that it became particularly important for us during Starbound's early access period. Early on in development, we'd intended to release new updates very frequently, so fortnightly even. But this ended up being impractical for us, so we ended up shifting our focus to bigger but less frequent updates. And 2015 is when we kind of really hit our stride with this. So instead of just throwing out our updates there with a changelog and a couple of screenshots, we began to theme our updates around a headlining feature. So we released an update called the Colony Update, which it's really dark, but you can kind of see it here. in which the headlining feature was the tenancy system that I mentioned earlier. We released an update called the Combat Update, which totally revamped Starbound's combat system. We also started to release these early access updates with an accompanying trailer to better show off the feature, as well as highlight other exciting additions to the game. People were still a bit wary and waiting on full release, but in the meantime, the community seemed to find these updates more appealing and more noteworthy than our previous efforts. And it was at this point as well that we kind of started to acknowledge that we were really not good at ETAs, and we stopped trying to publicly estimate the game's release date. We kind of abandoned mistakes like soon and definitely this year, and we finally settled on like just when it's done. It'll be done when it's done. And it was done and finally released on July 22nd, 2016. We kind of announced the release date just 2 weeks prior to release during a live stream, which worked really well for us. We dropped the update trailer when the 1.0 release was actually live on Steam. And we've subsequently had our best year of sales since 2013, with higher overall sales and a higher average of concurrent players than we've seen since our initial launch in early access. We've planned and shipped multiple free updates, and we've been able to drop nightly builds and regain the element of surprise so that new features and new content reveals happen when the features are in a better place for feedback. And for the most part, players seem satisfied with this. They seem satisfied that Starbound was worth their $15. Due to the nature of Starbound's development, there are some players who prefer older versions of, or parts of earlier versions of the game, but we've also had a really large influx of new players who are experiencing Starbound for the first time in its finished state. We're still a small studio, though, so with many of us moving on to some of Chucklefish's new projects, we no longer have as much time to spend maintaining some of those avenues of communication. So while community sentiment is generally a lot more positive since 1.0, we can feel kind of the lingering frustration when we haven't posted for a while, and we're still working on how to deal with that. One thing we've taken on doing is hosting a casual weekly building competition on the Starbound subreddit. The community votes in the week's entries, and the winner's build is posted on our social media accounts. Previously, this competition was hosted by members of the community. It was a lot more sort of casual, but since taking on hosting duties ourselves, we've found it easier to keep track of and sort of promote the entries in our own channel, and participation in the competition has kind of increased, we've found. It also provides us with weekly community content to post on Facebook and Twitter, and our developer blogs, sort of in between updates. So it's also just really inspiring to see the sorts of beautiful things that people are creating in our game. So I really liked this one. We did the theme "This is Fine," in which people had to create a situation in which things were not fine. And someone created, I think we might be living in a computer simulation. And I thought it was really clever. So yeah, in conclusion, sort of, I don't know if this is news to you, but making a game is hard. I think every studio makes mistakes, runs into production issues, reworks features, changes their minds about things. When your game is in early access, all of your completely average development mistakes are now public, which adds a lot of pressure to an already super intense situation. So our strategy throughout Starbound's development was to essentially just talk a lot, to be as transparent as we could about what we were doing, and when that didn't work, to provide tangible proof of what we were doing. And over time, we've had to become more careful about that, about what we say and when, and how we present things, but talking is still ultimately our strategy, and we believe that's been to our benefit. Starbound was our first game as a studio, and we had a lot to learn. We didn't make it through early access without upsetting some people, and for a while it felt like the public perception was that Starbound would just never be finished. But we did make it through, and I think our reputation has recovered a bit, and we've proven ourselves as a studio that can deliver, even if it took 5 years. And Starbound's Steam review score is kind of recovered and stands at 90%, and we're still kind of working on the other 10%. But yeah, that's all I've got, so thank you for listening. If we have time, which I think we have some, I can take some questions, if there are any. There's someone with a microphone.
So I have 2 questions.
Sure.
If you could redo it, would you still do the nightly builds? And number 2 is, have you done any kind of traditional marketing, or has it all been like social marketing like this?
Okay, so for question 1, I think that we would do the nightly builds again. I don't think that we would want to do them again on our next project, simply because I think that it was a response to a situation that had arisen, more than something that we had set out to do initially. It did kind of suck to lose that element of like, here's this big feature reveal, instead of just like people digging through the assets and finding things. As for marketing, we've done mostly just sort of marketing via social media channels. We've never sort of paid for ads. We've never kind of done more traditional marketing. Any other questions?
Hi, could you tell me roughly how many people worked on the game, and on average, how much time did they spend in community management?
Sure. It's difficult to say how much time people individually spent in community management. Now we have 16 people overall at our studio. There was a time before, leading up to release, where every person in the studio was working on Starbound. Now it's a smaller team of about 4. And before then, starting out, we had a team of about 8. So it's kind of shifted over time. Everybody's always just kind of kept an eye on things, as really. So like just kind of making, like checking Reddit or checking the forums or something, reading what people are saying, a part of their day. Even when I encouraged them not to as much, because it was my job to kind of protect them from and filter out the feedback. But yeah. Anybody else? Hey.
It's two questions.
Sure.
That sounds like a phenomenal amount of energy that you put into your community. How much time, as a percentage, for example, was the team spending doing that?
I would say that it was mostly me. It was mostly my role to kind of keep an eye on the community. But like I said, everybody kind of spent like they would kind of look after maybe once a day or a couple of times a day, just checking on Reddit and seeing what people were saying and responding to things. Sometimes people did it in their own time. It wasn't something as such that like we sort of scheduled for people other than me. It was just something that everybody did kind of organically. Great. Does that answer that?
It does, thank you.
Okay.
And the other question is kind of related, but would you intend to follow this same kind of blueprint again for your other projects?
I think that right now we're working on a game called Wargroove, and I think that we have a much better idea of how to start off the project and how to sort of market it from the start. We've paid a lot more attention to that now that we're kind of more organized as a studio. I don't think that we would follow this necessarily the same blueprint, but I think that as a first game, that ended up doing quite well despite us kind of blundering through it a bit. It's more just sort of about this is what we did and this is how we kind of solved some of the issues that arose from what we did, rather than like this is how you should make your early access game, because I'm not sure that this approach would necessarily work, but maybe get some ideas out of it.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This will need to be the last question.
Hey, I might have misunderstood, but it sounds like you started working on the game before you had a company in place and things like that, and you were separated around the world. And how did the process of bringing the company together work? How complicated was that?
It was quite complicated. So we were all sort of all over the world. The company had been created, and then we sort of, I think it was all sort of contract-based from the start, and then we, once we had gotten pre-order funding, we looked into hiring a business manager, and then she was like a godsend and kind of organized all of the getting visas for people because we were all in different countries, and finding an office and stuff like that. So hire a business manager would be my advice. Cool. Is that all the time we had for questions?
We've probably got enough time for one more.
Does anybody else?
Yeah.
Sure.
So if you were all in...
Sorry.
Maybe you said it at the beginning because I missed the very beginning. But so how did you all meet?
Initially, I wasn't there from the start. I started sort of in February 2012, a little bit after the game had been announced. Initially, our director, Finn Bryce, had just kind of approached people via game dev Reddit and also IRC channels, and also just contacts that he'd made after he had worked on Terraria as the artist. It just kind of formed that way. I actually signed on to try and be a voice actor initially. I was trying to break into the industry, and they were looking for somebody to do voice acting, which we ultimately didn't end up having in the game. And I was terrible at it, but it kind of got my foot in the door, so I just kind of clung on and ended up managing the community. So I think that's probably, yeah, cool. Thank you everybody for listening.